Good morning, everyone. God bless you on this Sunday morning. On behalf of the New Beginning Church of God Sunday School Department, our Pastor Bishop Leroy Odom, our First Lady Evangelist Willa Odom, and our Sunday School Superintendent, Missionary Sabrina Morgan, we are glad that you decided to join us for another Sunday School lesson. We are in our summer quarter of the Union Gospel Series lessons, and our main theme of study is people of valor, people exhibiting great courage in the face of danger, especially in battle. Our study today is found under Unit 2, Courage Facing Threats, and we are at Lesson 7, entitled Nehemiah Combats Derision and Danger. The lesson is based in the book of Nehemiah, the 4th chapter, in verses 1 through 9. In today's lesson, we explore tools of empowerment for withstanding ridicule from the enemy as we examine the story of Nehemiah. When we look at the title of this lesson, Nehemiah Combats Derision and Danger, derision refers to contemptuous ridicule or mockery, scornful ridicule. And when we think about ridicule, that deals with making fun of someone in a harsh way and to mock them. And there's different forms of the word derision. Derision is a noun, but we can use words such as deride, which is the verb, or derisive comments, or to deride one, or having to combat derision. So this all deals with mockery. So let us start by considering the following. One of Satan's most frequently employed weapons against Christians is ridicule. No one, including followers of Christ, enjoys being ridiculed by other people. Even the threat of being publicly mocked for speaking up for Christ causes some to never let their voice be heard. Rather than allowing themselves to be the object of another person's scorn, they simply stay quiet to avoid any problems. We who follow Christ must understand that the world we are proclaiming the gospel to does not want to hear it. We have a message that is in conflict with their sinful desires, and they do not want to listen to anyone tell them they need to repent. In order to silence anyone who would tell them they need to seek forgiveness, they will often resort to name-calling and even character assassination. We will learn in this week's lesson, however, that we must be strong and stand firm even when people laugh at us and deride us. This diagram, combating derisive attacks. And when we look at it, we see we have physical, mental, and emotional in the middle amongst the triangle in the circle. So to combat threats, frustration, the effect of lies, effects of attempted violence against you, you must keep your physical being, mental being, and emotional being in balance. Accepting God's redemptive plan through Christ, having faith, belief in God, being obedient, praying, have a communication with God, relationship with God, getting to know the Lord, spending time with God, quiet times, will help accomplish this balance of your physical, mental, and emotional well-being. And you need a balance of these three entities in order to combat derisive attacks. The aim today to discuss that God will bless and empower those who absorb the ridicule of the enemy. And when we think about absorbing the ridicule, to absorb something is to take it in or soak it up, but we don't want to internalize the ridicule such that we are holding on to it, but we're speaking more so to soak it up to avoid any potential stain of the mockery, so that there is no lasting effect on you. The life application, to determine to seek the applause of heaven rather than the accolades of man. So your focal point is not seeking the praises of man so much, but the applause of heaven, meaning that you're focusing more on your prayer life and communication with God and living righteously, as opposed to seeking to please others. The events of this lesson are estimated to have taken place around 445 BC or 444 BC, in that time period. The biblical events of Scripture take place mainly in three continents, which are Europe, Asia, and Africa, which you see circled here in red. Today, our focus is on the continent of Asia. The place of focus is Jerusalem, and you'll see Jerusalem here circled in the red line pointing towards it. You'll see a star on top of the name of Jerusalem, because this is ultimately the holy city, the prominent place of Israel. Let us discuss the background of events that lead up to the events that we're going to focus on in this lesson. Despite the Lord's miraculous deliverance of his people out of bondage in Egypt into the promised land of Canaan, the Hebrews continually disobeyed God. Kings were appointed to rule the nation, but many of the kings did not serve the Lord. God sent prophets to warn the people to abstain from idolatry and other sins against the Lord, but the Hebrews did not heed their warnings. God had promised Israel that if they obeyed him, he would bless them as a nation. If they did not, then he would judge them and cause them to be taken into captivity. And you can review that in Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter. In 930 BC, after King Solomon's reign, the unified monarchy of Israel was split into two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. And if you recall last week, we talked about the kingdom of Israel in the north containing 10 tribes, and the kingdom of Judah in the south containing 2 tribes, which were Judah and Benjamin. So because of disobedience, the kingdom of Israel was ultimately destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BC. The kingdom of Judah was destroyed in a series of invasions by the Babylonians thereafter. So beginning in 605 BC, the Babylonians took the people of Judah into captivity. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, set fire to Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in 586 BC. So the takeover begins in 605 BC. The exile begins where the children of Israel are removed from their territory, and then the temple is destroyed in 586 BC. While they were in exile, the people from Judah became known as Jews. Judah became an administrative division within the Persian Empire when Babylon fell to the Persians in 539 BC. Now the Israelites of the northern kingdom were absorbed into Assyria and eventually into other cultures. But the southern kingdom, Judah, that was taken over by Babylon, after the power of Babylon was broken by the Medes and Persians in 539 BC, many of the Jews returned to their homeland. We have a diagram here that talks about the 3 returns from exile. And remember, the exile, we're talking about the state of being barred from one's native country. So when the children of Israel from the kingdom of Judah were exiled from their country, taken out by the Babylonians, put into captivity. Now you have 3 stages of them making their way back to their homeland. So after being in captivity for 70 years, if we count from 605 BC when the Babylonian takeover began, 70 years from that takes us to about 535 BC. At that time, we have now a return to the homeland of some of the children of Israel, which are now known as Jews. And so we're going to touch on this, where we have the Zerubbabel going back with a faction of individuals, and then you have Ezra, and then we hit Nehemiah, and that's where our lesson is. In 538 BC, Cyrus, the Persian, conqueror of Babylon, allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. The first group returned to Judah under the leadership of Zerubbabel. Over a period of years and tremendous opposition from the Samaritans, the returnees eventually succeeded in rebuilding the temple in 515 BC. A number of years later, in 458 BC, a second group of Jews returned led by Ezra. Arriving on the scene, they found the Jews in Israel in a state of spiritual and moral degradation. So time has passed now. They had intermarried with the unbelieving peoples of the surrounding nations and were participating in their pagan practices. However, through Ezra's faithful teaching ministry, the majority of these people turned from their sins and once again followed God's will for their lives. In 444 BC, 14 years after Ezra's return to Jerusalem, Nehemiah also returned, and God used him to guide Judah in rebuilding the city's walls and in reordering the people's social and economic lives. So just to have an appreciation of where we are now, we see how the kingdom of Judah was overtaken by Babylon, and we see the progression now of them getting back to their homeland. So you have Zerubbabel first and the rebuilding of the temple, and then you have Ezra and others coming back. And now you have Nehemiah. And this is where we are, so you can just see the progression of events. And now Nehemiah is coming back, and the wall needs to be rebuilt. The wall had been destroyed, but now it needs to be rebuilt. Know that Nehemiah grew up in captivity in Persia. So Nehemiah wasn't one of the Israelites that had been exiled, but he grew up during the exile. So he grew up in captivity in Persia. So after Babylon took over, then Persia conquered Babylon. Now you have Nehemiah growing up under the Persian regime. The name Nehemiah means Yahweh comforts, or my comfort is Yahweh. Nehemiah was the son of Hakaliah, who is otherwise unknown. He had several brothers. Nehemiah served as the official cupbearer of the Persian king, Artaxerxes. Further, a cupbearer was an officer of a high rank in ancient Egyptian, Persian, Assyrian, and Jewish courts. It was the duty of the cupbearer to fill the king's cup and deliver it to him. According to Xenophon, ancient cupbearers drank some of the king's wine to see if it was poisoned before they offered the cup to him. So you could imagine that if one is going to be a cupbearer, then the one selecting them to be a cupbearer must trust that individual, must think highly of that individual. So it speaks to the character and possibly background of Nehemiah, the fact that he was chosen to be the cupbearer. And you may be wondering who Xenophon is. Xenophon is a Greek historian and student of Socrates who lived in the late 5th and early 4th centuries BC. His historical writings cover events in the ancient Near East, especially concerning the Medes and Persians. His work, Zaropedia, includes an account of the overthrow of Babylon by Cyrus the Great in 539 BC. Thus, Xenophon provides an extra biblical witness to the fall of Babylon. And I raise this here because it just lends credence and lets us know that there's outside sources that talk about events that occurred. Focusing in on Nehemiah, getting to where we are with this lesson, understand that Nehemiah still understood a heritage of his forefathers. So in all of the captivity and exile, that did not get lost. So either through oral traditions and maybe some writings still kept, the individuals coming after those that were exiled will still kept abreast of the promises of God. So when Nehemiah learned that the people in Jerusalem were in great distress, he mourned and fasted day and night for the sins of the children of Israel. He cried unto God to remember his covenant. he asked King Artaxerxes to allow him to return to Jerusalem. You'll find this account in Nehemiah, the first chapter. And just to read a few of those verses to get the effect of where we are in the state of mind of Nehemiah. That Hanani, one of my brethren, came, and this is Nehemiah speaking, he and certain men of Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said unto me, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. And it came to pass, when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept, and mourned certain days, and fasted, and prayed before the God of heaven, and said, I beseech thee, O Lord God of heaven, the great and terrible God that keepeth covenant and mercy for them that love him and observe his commandments. Let thine ear now be attentive, and thine eyes open, that thou mayest hear the prayer of thy servant, which I pray before thee now day and night, for the children of Israel thy servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against thee. Both I and my father's house have sinned. We have dealt very corruptly against thee, and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the judgments, which thou commandest thy servant Moses. Remember, I beseech thee, the word that thou commandest thy servant Moses, saying, if ye transgress, I will scatter you abroad among the nations. But if ye turn unto me, and keep my commandments, and do them, though there were of you cast out unto the uttermost part of the heaven, yet will I gather them from thence, and will bring them unto the place that I have chosen to set my name there. Now these are thy servants and thy people, whom thou hast redeemed by thy great power, and by thy strong hand. O Lord, I beseech thee, let now thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servant, and to the prayer of thy servants, who desire to fear thy name. And prosper, I pray thee, thy servant this day, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer. This discourse of Nehemiah is praying to God and acknowledging the wrong of his ancestors and what they have done, and acknowledging the fact of how God indicated that if they were disobedient, they would be overtaken and spread out from their land. But now he's seeking God's grace and mercy, and asking that he have basically grace to address this issue further with the king, and that the king will give him some level of release to go see about the people of Jerusalem. As Nehemiah led the effort to rebuild the wall to protect Jerusalem, he faced great opposition from the enemies of the Jews. So understand that the king granted Nehemiah the opportunity to go back and see about Jerusalem, and he wanted to go back and rebuild that wall. And in doing that, faced great opposition, and that's where we pick up this lesson. In facing opposition in doing a work for God, facing opposition and how to handle that. As we see in Nehemiah 2, 9 through 10, it says, Then I came to the governors beyond the river, and gave them the king's letters. And these are the letters that Artaxerxes gave to Nehemiah to be able to navigate and make his way through the land to get to Jerusalem. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant the Ammonite heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. So he's coming to see about his people, Nehemiah, and Sanballat and Tobiah are really having no parts of it, because what they're talking about doing, Nehemiah, would be shoring up Jerusalem, protecting it, building the wall back. And because of political reasons and other reasons, Sanballat and Tobiah are seeking to stop it. So let's pick up our scriptures for today. Nehemiah 4:1-3. But it came to pass that when Sanballat heard that we builded the wall, he was wroth, and took great indignation, and mocked the Jews. And he spake before his brethren and the army of Samaria, and said, What do these feeble Jews? Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of the rubbish which are burned? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was by him, and he said, Even that which they build, if a fox go up, he shall even break down their stone wall. News that Nehemiah was in Jerusalem to rebuild the wall was not welcomed by key people in powerful positions. Among those who were angry about Nehemiah's construction project was Sanballat, an important political figure who would later serve as governor of Samaria. Sanballat was more than merely annoyed by Nehemiah's presence, he was enraged by it. Sanballat set out to oppose the rebuilding project as soon as he learned what Nehemiah was doing. He began by accusing Nehemiah of rebelling against the king. This accusation had no merit because Nehemiah had the blessing from the king of Persia to rebuild the walls. You know, sometimes people seek to throw discourse at what you're doing, and just the angles they come at you with do not make sense, and you can't fall into that and get distracted by it. Sanballat refused to allow Nehemiah to work in peace, however, and resorted to ridiculing the entire project. If I can't stop you another way, I'm just going to talk about you and seek to discourage you. And that's what Sanballat did here. Sanballat realized that by himself he would not be able to prevent the Jews from rebuilding the wall, so he enlisted the help of his allies, which included the army of Samaria. Along with Tobiah the Ammonite, he mocked the Jews for thinking they could complete the wall and offer sacrifices of thanksgiving for it. So here it is, Nehemiah and the Jews engaging in a good thing, seeking to rebuild the wall for their territory, for Jerusalem. And here it is, those that don't want the city fortified for their own political reasons seek to stop them. And that's how it is in life. When you're doing something productive, there are others that seek to stop you. And there are those that will make mockery of what you're doing, or they will try to discourage you from what you're doing. He dismissed their efforts, claiming they had deficient building materials. Tobiah remarked that even if they did rebuild the wall, it would be knocked down as soon as something so small as a fox jumped up on it. So here you have Tobiah remarking that what you're doing is not even going to be productive, or the wall not even sturdy enough. Even a fox is something as small as a fox. If it jumps on, it's going to come down. So those are just remarks that continuously discourage one. Our practical point number 1 says God's people can expect opposition when they are doing God's work. So understand that people will come against you when you're seeking to do something good. When you're doing the work of God, people will talk about you, but you have to be able to withstand. Practical point number 2, God's enemies underestimate his power and the strength of his love for his people. Know that God is with you. The enemy doesn't understand how much God is with you and the love that God has for you. So when you're doing the work of God, just stand strong and do the work. If God has set something in your heart to do, and it's his work that he's set before you to do the work. And do not get distracted by those around you. That's where you have to have a fortification of your mind and your attitude and your approach. You have to stand strong. Nehemiah 4:4-5. Hear, O our God, for we are despised, and turn their reproach upon their own head, and give them for a prey in the land of captivity. and cover not their iniquity, and let not their sin be blotted out from before thee, for they have provoked thee to anger before the builders. One may look at this prayer and say, wow, it doesn't seem that Nehemiah is having mercy on the ridiculers. So let's delve into this. Nehemiah responded to the verbal assault of Sanballat and Tobiah by praying to the Lord and asking for his help. He understood that the enemy was not merely taunting him, but was trying to intimidate and threaten him. The fact that Sanballat went to the army is an indication he was willing to use force if necessary. Nehemiah's words to God are reminiscent of King David's imprecatory psalms, in which he asks God to judge his enemies. When we talk about imprecatory, it refers to invoking God's condemnation on enemies. So this is more like an imprecatory type of prayer. So Nehemiah asks God to pay back the scoffers for their mocking, even to send them into captivity in a foreign land and remember their sin. He wanted justice, not mercy, for his enemies. How should a Christian interpret this kind of praying, especially in view of what Jesus Christ said about praying for one's enemies? Several facts need to be noted. First, in opposing the Jews, Sanballat and company were actually opposing God. Second, God had already pronounced judgment on Israel's enemies. Nehemiah was praying according to God's will, that God would deliver Jerusalem from her enemies. Third, Nehemiah was praying that God would bring about what he had promised Abraham regarding those who curse his people. Fourth, vengeance belongs to God, not to Nehemiah or other believers. We are welcome to bring our problems to God. We should pray for his glory and his will to be done. Now understand, the Nehemiah story is in the Old Testament. We are in this dispensation of grace. In this dispensation of grace, Jesus told us to pray for the salvation and reform of our enemies, not for judgment against them. He calls us to grace, forgiveness, and love. Practical point number 3, the best way to respond to threats is always with prayer. Pray. Utilize that communication with God for direction as to how to respond. Sometimes when you respond in haste, you say the wrong things. When you're not level-headed and, something, touches you a particular way where it hurts, if you respond in the hurt, you don't always say the correct thing. But you ought to take a step back and be prayerful about everything that you do. Nehemiah 4 and 6. So built we the wall, and all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof, for the people had a mind to work. After praying, Nehemiah and the Jews continued with the work. Some Christians pray and then wait for things to happen, but not Nehemiah. As in all his efforts, he blended the divine perspective with the human. He faced Sanballat's opposition with both prayer and hard work. Once he committed the problem to the Lord, he trusted God to help them achieve their goal. And while praying and trusting, they rebuilt the wall to half its height. At this juncture, their task was half completed. Sanballat and Tobiah's efforts at demoralizing the Jews failed. The Jews rose above their enemies' attempts at discouragement. Because the people worked so diligently and enthusiastically with all their heart, they were able to complete half the job in a surprisingly short period of time. The people had a mind to work. The things people say may hurt us, but they can never harm us unless we let them get into our system and poison us. If we spend time pondering the enemy's words, we will give Satan a foothold from which he can launch another attack closer to home. The best thing to do is to pray and commit the whole thing to the Lord, and then get back to your work. Anything that keeps you from doing what God has called you to do will only help the enemy. Practical point number 4, United perseverance in God's work fights off the discouragement our enemies seek to sow. United. So when we're talking about a body of people such as the Jews coming together to build that wall, we look at our churches just working together as children of God together. You think about families working together. United perseverance in God's work fights off the discouragement our enemies seek to sow. So it's hard for the enemy to pierce a united front of people that have a mind to work and to do. Nehemiah 4:7-9, our last verses. But it came to pass that when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up and that the breaches began to be stopped, then they were very wroth and conspired all of them together to come and to fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it. Nevertheless, we made our prayer unto our God and set a watch against them day and night because of them. Word reached Sanballat, Tobiah, and the other enemies of the Jews that they still continued work on the wall, and their anger at the Jewish effort increased. So here it is, half the wall built, and they're still at it. So often when you stay at something and someone's trying to stop you, if you just stay at it, it just makes them angrier. But don't focus on their anger, focus on the job that you have to do. Stay focused. A common enemy and a common cause brought 4 different groups together to stop the work on the walls of Jerusalem. The city was now completely surrounded by enemies. To the north were Sanballat and the Samaritans. To the east, Tobiah and the Ammonites. To the south, Geshem and the Arabs. To the west, the Ashdodites. Ashdod was perhaps the most important city in Philistia at that time, and the Philistines did not want to see a strong community in Jerusalem. Do not expect the enemy to go away just because you are faithful and praying. Important to be faithful, important to pray, but don't think the enemy is going to leave just because you are doing that. Satan is a relentless adversary who will oppose virtually everything God does through you. So in order to be victorious, you must persevere and be prepared for a long battle. Practical point number 5, threats, confusion, and discord are tools Satan uses to hinder God's work. Doing a work for God, people sometimes try to make things confusing, or they throw discord, meaning they try to put trouble into the issue, maybe say things that you didn't say, try to confuse the issue, make others that may be working with you not want to work with you, and just causing trouble or threatening that if you continue this good work, I'm going to do, maybe pull away support from you. But you have to stand in there. Continue to do the right thing. God will help you through it all. We defeat the devil's plans when we stay connected to God in prayer and stay alert to the enemy's schemes. The corporate strategy of Judah's enemies was met by a corporate response. Again, the people, we prayed for help and then added action to their prayers by posting a guard round the clock to meet this threat. Our reflection today: no tactic used by Satan can tear down the wall of faith that surrounds those who trust the Lord. So no tactic used by Satan can tear down the wall of faith that surrounds those who trust the Lord. Remember this diagram combating the risk of attacks. To combat threats, frustration, the effects of lies on your life, the effects of attempted violence against you, you must keep your physical being, mental being, and emotional being in balance. So remember having a prayer life, a relationship with God, trusting Him, accepting Him, the Spirit of God, allowing it to work within your life and provide protection. Have a quiet time to keep your physical, mental, and emotional well-beings in balance. The Jews, led by Nehemiah, refused to buckle under the pressure of Sanballat and Tobiah's vicious attacks. They completed the wall in only 52 days. This was an amazing achievement considering the obstacles they faced on a minute-by-minute basis. The key to their accomplishment was that they were doing it for the Lord and trusting Him completely to help them finish what they had started. Opposition, especially when laced with mockery and derision, can be ruinously discouraging, but we need not let it be. If instead of getting wrapped up in the taunting, we look to God and His steady power, we can press on with what He wants us to do and bring glory to Him. When we engage in serving God, we can expect both spiritual and physical opposition. Nehemiah's response was to go to the Lord in prayer. Sadly, today prayer is often the last thing we do instead of the first. And remember, fervent, faithful prayer does not exclude the need to be wise in planning a tactical response to opposition. Let us live out the calling God has given us with fervent prayer and without hesitation. We thank you for joining us for another Sunday school session. Remember to have courage and faith as you trust in God daily. Pray for strength. He will bless you and provide for you. Until next time, be blessed.